on Jerusalem Dateline. This week on Jerusalem Dateline, we look at the global impact of the 1967 Six-Day War 52 years ago, when the city of Jerusalem was reunited after more than 2,000 years. Plus, sifting treasures from under the Temple Mount and what it means for the Jewish people. And counting the Omer. What does it have to do with the celebration of Pentecost? All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israelis came to pay their last respects to Israel's First Lady, Nehama Rivlin, who died a day before her 74th birthday. Rivlin eulogized his beloved wife.
I looked at the date so familiar, 5th of June. Happy birthday, sweetheart. A sad birthday. Thank you, Nehama, for love, for your partnership, for family, for being always with me, for the supportive hand and the listening heart, for the humor and the sharp thought, and for giving me the privilege to be the husband of the president's wife. Many waters cannot quench love. Rivers cannot sweep it away. Rest in peace.
Nehama underwent a lung transplant 3 months ago. She's been suffering from a lung disease since 2007. Nehama was born on a moshav in central Israel in 1945 to parents who had emigrated from the Ukraine. She worked as a researcher at Hebrew University in Jerusalem in zoology, ecology, and genetics. She married Rivlin in 1971, and they had 3 children. Rivlin became president in 2014, and Nehama focused her attention on art, activities for children with special needs, and the environment. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife Sarah attended the funeral and expressed deep sorrow for her passing on behalf of all the citizens of Israel. Well, this year, Israelis marked the 52nd anniversary of the Six-Day War and Jerusalem Day, the time when Jerusalem was reunited under Israeli sovereignty. A lot has happened since then. The world has seen the Iron Curtain fall and global terrorism rise. Through it all, at least one alliance has thrived, the United States and Israel. President Trump has made that bond even stronger by moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and recognizing Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights. As John Wagi explains, although this bond has been tested, it stood the test of time.
The foundation of the U.S.-Israel alliance began in the Six-Day War. After Israel took back its biblical heartland, including Jerusalem in 1967, the whole world took notice. Israel's friends and millions of Americans rejoiced, but Israel's enemies began to call the U.S. the big Satan and Israel the little Satan.
When Israel won the Six-Day War, it was huge. Because you went from anticipating disaster, it wasn't that long after the Holocaust, and perhaps another massacre of the Jewish people, to an incredible victory.
Ambassador Dori Gold is the former director of Israel's foreign ministry.
I remind you, in global terms, the U.S. had been bogged down in Vietnam, trying to contain the spread of Soviet power in the Far East. And here, all of a sudden, Israel stands firm and not only defeats its Arab neighbors, but defeats clients of the Soviet Union who were using Soviet weaponry. So it was a victory for Israel, it was the survival of the Jewish people, and it was an enormous victory for the West.
Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg says Israel's defeat of the Soviet proxies woke up the White House under President Lyndon Johnson.
Suddenly, this little scrappy Israel was seen as an outpost, a frontal forward position of Western democracy that had the capacity to defeat Soviet MiGs, Soviet tanks, Soviet tactics, Soviet-trained soldiers. So suddenly, the United States thought, maybe Israel's more important than we thought geopolitically. And it was quite galvanizing to what became the most important alliance in the history of the 20th century, the alliance between the United States and Israel.
President Johnson told the Russians no when they called for Israel to give up all of the territory recaptured in the war. Johnson made clear that Israel would have secure and recognized boundaries, a policy expanded by Presidents Reagan and Bush.
And that became the basis of American diplomacy for decades. And only recently some people talk about a full Israeli withdrawal. That would be contrary to Israel's national security today, and it certainly was contrary to Israel's national security back then.
In the half-century since the war, Israel has become a military power, as threats around it have also grown. Iran pursues nuclear ambitions while calling for Israel's destruction. Its terror arm in Lebanon, Hezbollah, has more than 100,000 missiles poised on Israel's north. And the old bear, Russia, is back in the region, looking for a foothold. Gold warns Iran's ties to nuclear North Korea and the Mexican drug cartels put the threat on the U.S. doorstep.
The entire Iranian ballistic missile program, to a large extent, is connected with North Korea's ballistic missile program. Both of us have an interest in making sure that the proliferation of ballistic missiles to rogue states be stopped.
As Europe becomes more Muslim, the whole idea of Western civilization is shifting. Rosenberg believes the changes could mean more fulfillment of Bible prophecy in the Middle East.
One of the worst case scenarios for Israel is if Russia and or Iran end up controlling what's left of Syria as it continues to implode. If it's Iran, you'll have an apocalyptic, genocidal Shia theocracy just over the border. If the Russians ask the Iranians to leave, you still have Russia, a nuclear-armed power, right on Israel's border. And according to Bible prophecy, particularly Ezekiel 38 and 39, we know Russia and Iran will form an alliance together against Israel and will come against Israel from the north in the end times. I'm not saying we're there yet, but the trend lines continue to be consistent with the preparation for those Gog and Magog prophecies.
John Waggy, CBN News, Jerusalem.
During the battle for Jerusalem in 1967, Israeli paratroopers made their way to Mount Scopus. And just before descending to capture the old city, a fierce battle took place with Jordanian soldiers, where a number lost their lives. It's on this hallowed ground that an historic archaeological project is underway called the Temple Mount Sifting Project. While Jerusalem's Temple Mount has never been excavated, at least publicly, an illegal construction project 20 years ago led to discoveries about its ancient past. In 1999, the Islamic Religious Authority responsible for the Temple Mount began construction on a large underground mosque. They also broke a law prohibiting unauthorized construction. During construction, they dumped tons of debris into the Kidron Valley. This pile is just a small part of the debris recovered from the Temple Mount. Over the years, the Temple Mount Sifting Project has uncovered a treasure trove of artifacts, like this piece of pottery, throughout Jerusalem's history.
The Temple Mount Sifting Project is an archaeological adventure whose purpose is to find the empirical proof of what was atop the Temple Mount thousands of years ago.
Throughout its history, more than 250,000 volunteers have worked on the Sifting Project, making it the largest archaeological project in history. Since its beginning, the project has uncovered enormous archaeological evidence.
We have, until now, approximately 500,000 finds. The vast majority of the material is from First Temple period and on, starting in the 10th century BC, which is the time of David and Solomon. And that goes hand in hand with the biblical account.
While the Sifting Project began years ago, a new phase is just beginning. Some believe the evidence from the project validates the Jewish claim and connection to the city of Jerusalem.
Here we show black and white and on nice pieces of pottery and other things that we have been here for 3,000 years. It's very simple. There's no project that shows it better than this one. It proves that everything we've said about it and thought about it and dreamt about it and prayed about it is true.
And we know where we came from, based, of course, on our faith, based, of course, on our heritage, but also based on the empirical evidence that we find about where indeed we were.
Barkai says the importance of the Temple Mount to the Jewish people and to the world is profound.
First of all, the Temple Mount is the soul, heart, and spirit of the Jewish people. It is mentioned and indicated more than 20 times in the New Testament. It is a focal point in the activity of Jesus, and it should be one of the cornerstones of Western civilization. And it is also the archaeological site number one in the country, and probably one of the most important archaeological sites of the world.
Now they're sending out an open invitation for more to come.
People today can literally get a telegram from someone from thousands of years ago to show them where things were and what things were and where things are going for the future.
This sifting project that you can see behind us here is really going to be a major thing for people from around the world to go in and put their hands into and work through soil that came from the temple itself from some point in its history.
Come sift the dirt from 2,000 years ago, come be part of history, both what was and also what will be.
Coming up, thousands of Christian leaders from around the world come up to Jerusalem.
I do believe the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast is one of the most exciting new initiatives that came out here in Jerusalem.
For the third year in a row, Christian leaders from around the world came up to Jerusalem for the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. 700 delegates representing nearly 70 nations heard what is on the hearts and minds of Israeli leaders and public figures. Here's what some of the participants had to say.
I find it quite fascinating that just last week, the president of my country, Nigeria, in his first 24 hours after his inauguration, flew to Saudi Arabia and took a position against Israel. And that means that he's literally invoking curses on our nation. And I feel that the prayers that I prayed today, prayers revoking the curses is brought upon us, and praying for the peace of Jerusalem will help bring a turnaround in our nation.
It's just been an amazing experience to see people from all over the world, the many nations coming together to pray for peace, because peace in Jerusalem really means peace for the rest of the world. It's amazing to see political people, pastoral people, and those in leadership coming from their nations to come together in unity, because unity doesn't mean uniformity. It means coming together and agreeing on something and being able to seek God on a matter, and that's when He hears us.
For me as a Romanian, the issue about the embassy was something important, because we know, understand in Romania, Christians mainly, that our blessing for our nation, it's connected directly with our alignment with the God's plan for Israel. So in Romania we pray a lot through our media tools. We have programs challenging people, Christians in Romania, to pray for Israel. Romania became more like a prayer partner for Israel.
God commands everyone to pray for peace at Jerusalem. It's one of the only times in the Bible that God even asks you to pray for anything. People pray because they need things, health, wealth, success. But one time God says, pray something for me, and that's Jerusalem. And the reason He does, at least the Jewish sages teach us, is that He wants people to keep the issue of Jerusalem close to their heart. He wants people to focus on Jerusalem. He wants to tell the children about Jerusalem, get involved in Jerusalem. So for Jews and Christians who believe in the Bible, everyone's got to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and also understand that Jerusalem is the focal point for today's conflicts, and that through prayer and action, we can make Jerusalem a credible place once again on this earth.
Last year it was a bit of a baptism of fire. It was like this, I've never seen anything quite on this scale before. But since last year I met some really good people here, and that's had a real effect on what we're doing in the UK as well. Some of those people have flown into the UK and we've done stuff from that. So these things, although the prayer breakfast itself is great, it's the connections that you make while you're here which is really important, and they're quite strategic, and so much good stuff comes out of that alone.
I do believe the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast is one of the most exciting new initiatives that came out here in Jerusalem.
it's absolutely important because it gathers in a very unique way the nations together here to Jerusalem to pray for Israel, but also to pray for their own nations and their relationship with Israel. So I believe it's one of the most strategic events that came out of Jerusalem in recent years.
Coming up, Messianic believers in Jerusalem come under assault on their way to a worship service. Here in Jerusalem, dozens of Jewish protesters recently attacked Messianic believers headed to a Hebrew worship concert. It's one example of hostility by certain Orthodox Jews against the Messianic community. Inside the King of Kings congregation, an audience listened to a concert of Hebrew worship songs. But outside, something else was going on.
30 to 40 religious men had gathered, and they started harassing our people as they were trying to enter into worship, blowing whistles, trying to drown out the sound of worship. And that alerted the first wave of the SWAT team from the police that came out.
The Messianic Jewish Alliance of Israel hosted the concert at the King of Kings Community Facility, one of the largest congregations in Jerusalem for Christians and Messianic Jews. Senior Pastor Chad Holland told CBN News a mob of protesters outside the facility's lobby attacked men, women, and children trying to attend the concert.
They started by screaming, pushing. Several people were hit, some were cut in the face. They broke glass, they damaged property. They were kicking, they were hitting, they were cornering people. They pushed several up against the wall. They pushed down several women as well. They threw water bottles, they spit on a lot of people, and in the end they started spraying pepper spray.
Some of the protesters held a sign from the far-right fringe group Lehava that opposes contact with non-Jews and a Christian presence in Israel. According to Holland, police had a hard time gaining control of the protesters.
They overran the first wave of the SWAT team. They ended up leaving. Then a second wave of regular level police came with the captain, and the mob scene overran them as well with numbers. And it took several hours before the police could rally enough of the SWAT team in full armor and helmets and face shields.
While evangelicals and other Christians are welcomed as friends by most Israeli sectors, Messianic Jews who believe Jesus is the Messiah are sometimes shunned.
Even though we tried to reason with them and discuss, hey, why are you guys so angry? They said that we were traitors. They chanted several times that we worship three gods. Now, of course, if you know anything about the Messianic theology, we believe in one God. And we tried to reason with them to explain to them that they had a misunderstanding. They later on didn't take too kindly to that explanation. They began to chant that we were Nazis at that point.
Holland said they'd welcome the opportunity to explain who they are and what they believe to the protesters.
We're certainly not the enemies of anybody worshiping God, but that we are believers in Yeshua. We serve one God and we believe in the Bible. So we'd love to sit down and talk to them if they would ever have us. We thank the police again, and we covet the prayers of all the believers around the world.
Holland said in the end the protesters didn't win because the concert went on as planned. Up next, we take a look at the Feast of Shavuot, the counting of the Omer, and what it means for Christians at Pentecost. During the 49 days between Passover and Shavuot, God commands the Jewish people to count the Omer each day. We asked Bible scholar Boaz Michael from First Fruits of Zion what it means to Jews and Christians.
In Leviticus 23, Hashem, God, gives the festivals, the feasts, the times and appointments of the Lord to the Jewish people, and he says, you shall declare these times and festivals. It begins with Shabbat, goes right into Passover, and then in Leviticus 23, verse 15, we have this obscure little reference to this time of counting. Hashem says to count 49 days or 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot. So for Christians, counting the Omer it's important because there's actually some links to this to the New Testament. For example, on the 40th day of the Omer was the time of our Master's ascension from the Mount of Olives. It's a time in which it brings a sense of focus as we lead up to something. You know, when my kids were little, I used to create a countdown calendar for them because I wanted them to anticipate a big event that was taking place that was upcoming. This is like a counting up calendar to a big event for the Jewish people. Perhaps even more importantly, it's a link. Think of a chain. The Omer connects Passover to Shavuot. It's an unbreakable chain, and there's an important spiritual lesson in this for us. It teaches us that salvation is both redemption, what took place at Passover, but it's also the indwelling of God's Spirit, empowering us to walk out that salvation. So in reality, Passover and Shavuot are connected and combined by the Omer. So by counting the Omer, we're thinking about, we're reflecting upon not only what took place at Passover just a few weeks ago, but we're leading up to a time in which God gave us His Torah, His instructions, His will, and His wisdom in order that we may be that saved, redeemed people that He set us free to be. So the Omer is counted every night after the evening prayers of Ma'ariv. We will say the Omer together. We'll say the day and the week and the time, and we'll acknowledge that. And then we'll read a text from Psalm chapter 67. So first of all, Psalm 67 was prayed during the count of the Omer during the time of the Master. So it's something that he and the disciples would have been praying along with the rest of the people of Israel. But it's a prophetic text. God has blessed us. God's blessed us because He redeemed us from Egypt. And He's blessed us that His way, His Torah, His instructions, His will and wisdom may be known amongst all nations. So that links us to Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where Yeshua tells His disciples, He says, you'll be my disciples, and you're going to take the message to Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to all the ends of the earth. So think of this. This is being prayed in the synagogue every night. It was prayed at the time of the Master. But then think of Acts chapter 2, what takes place in Shavuot and Pentecost. The Spirit comes down, the nations are represented, and the message was that God's salvation is not just for the Jewish people, but it's for all nations. And that's what took place in Acts chapter 2, was a fulfillment in many ways of this prayer that the Jewish people have prayed and continue to pray, that all nations, all people will know God and His instructions and His ways.
Well, to all our Jewish friends, Chag Shavuot Sameach, Happy Shavuot. And to Christians around the world, may this be a meaningful Pentecost. Well, that's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline. On Jerusalem Dateline.